Have you ever noticed how easily you tell yourself, "I'll handle it," even when a quiet part of you wishes someone would simply ask if you're okay? You learn to carry your own weight so early that depending on another person now feels strangely unfamiliar, almost unsafe. People admire your composure. They describe you as mature, independent, reliable. They rarely notice the small pause before you answer when someone offers help, or the way you instinctively solve every problem alone before anyone has the chance to stand beside you. Somewhere along the way, needing less became a form of survival. When the world finally becomes gentle, you don't immediately relax. You search for hidden conditions, waiting for the moment kindness asks for repayment. Even moments of peace can feel temporary, because a deeper part of you never truly believed comfort was meant to last. What makes this even stranger is that you may not remember the exact moment you became this way. It happened quietly, almost invisibly, until emotional independence stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like your identity. The deeper reason for that transformation reaches further into the human mind than most people ever realize. The difficult part is that almost no one sees the cost of carrying yourself this way. From the outside, you appear capable enough to navigate almost anything. Friends assume you do not need reassurance. Family believes you are the strong one. Even strangers quickly sense that you rarely ask for much. What looks like confidence often began as adaptation. Inside, the experience is very different. You replay conversations long after they end, wondering whether you revealed too much by admitting you were tired. You hesitate before sharing disappointment because you have learned to expect yourself to recover before anyone else notices. Even moments that should feel shared somehow become private responsibilities. There is also a loneliness that is difficult to explain because it does not come from being physically alone. It comes from realizing that people have grown accustomed to your strength while remaining unfamiliar with your vulnerability. The version of you that quietly struggles has become almost invisible, even to those who genuinely care. Over time, this invisible pattern begins shaping decisions that seem unrelated. You choose what feels manageable over what feels meaningful. You trust your self-reliance more than another person's consistency. Without realizing it, your life slowly organizes itself around avoiding dependence rather than pursuing connection. For decades, observers of human development kept encountering this quiet pattern, suggesting there may be a deeper psychological architecture beneath these experiences than most people ever imagine. The deeper explanation begins with a question that rarely crosses the mind. What happens when a person learns self-sufficiency before they have fully experienced emotional safety? The answer is not simply resilience. It is the gradual construction of an identity built around expecting less from the world than the heart naturally desires. Carl Jung believed that the personality quietly organizes itself around whatever helps us survive. The mind does not carefully separate temporary adaptations from permanent identity. If emotional independence protected you once, the unconscious often preserves it long after the original danger has disappeared, treating an old strategy as though it were an essential part of who you are. Over time, psychologists studying human development notice that children do not simply remember difficult environments, they absorb them into the way they interpret relationships. A child who repeatedly discovers that comfort must be created alone often grows into an adult who feels strangely uneasy when comfort arrives from someone else. Safety itself can become unfamiliar. This is why the struggle feels so confusing. You may genuinely long for closeness, while instinctively keeping one hand on the door. You appreciate kindness, yet part of you quietly prepares for disappointment before trust has even had a chance to grow. The conflict is not a lack of love. It is the unconscious protecting an older version of you that once believed emotional caution was necessary for survival. Seen this way, your independence is not merely a personality trait. It is a psychological language written long before you knew you were speaking it, and its hidden vocabulary begins revealing itself in ordinary moments you may never have questioned before. You meet someone who listens without interrupting. They remember small details, check on you without being asked, and offer help without making you feel indebted. Instead of feeling relieved, you become strangely restless. You begin searching for reasons to keep a little distance, not because they have done anything wrong, but because your mind has learned that closeness often arrives with invisible conditions. What appears to others as hesitation is sometimes an old survival instinct quietly protecting yesterday from becoming tomorrow again. Another person spends years building an impressive career. Promotions arrive, responsibilities increase, and everyone admires their discipline. Yet every achievement is followed by the same silent ritual. They return home, sit in the dark for a few minutes, and immediately begin planning the next task. Rest feels uncomfortable because accomplishment became the safest place to hide emotions that once had nowhere else to go. Success is real, but it has quietly become a substitute for feeling securely held. Someone else becomes the dependable friend everyone calls during difficult moments. Birthdays are remembered, problems are solved, and encouragement is always available. When the same person faces a difficult season, they tell almost nobody. They convince themselves that everyone is already carrying enough. The habit sounds generous, yet beneath it lies an old belief that personal needs create burdens rather than belonging. There is also the person who appears remarkably calm during conflict. While others argue, they remain composed, measured, almost impossible to provoke. People praise this emotional control without realizing how much remains unspoken. Later, alone, every sentence they wanted to say echoes through their mind. Silence protected relationships in the past, so it continues protecting them even when honesty would be safer than restraint. You might also recognize the individual who rarely celebrates good news. They quietly minimize achievements before anyone else can. Compliments are dismissed with a smile, dreams are described cautiously, and excitement is softened into modesty. Preparing for disappointment became so automatic that hope itself feels like something requiring careful supervision. Each of these lives looks different on the surface, yet they are often shaped by the same invisible pattern. The behaviors are not random personality quirks, but outward expressions of an inner system built long ago. What we notice in daily life is only the visible edge of a much deeper psychological landscape waiting beneath awareness. The deeper you look, the less this story becomes about independence itself, and the more it becomes about identity. Emotional independence is often admired because it appears strong from the outside. The unconscious, however, measures strength differently. It asks not only what you can endure, but also what you no longer allow yourself to feel. Rollo May wrote that much of human anxiety grows from the tension between who we truly are and who we believe we must become. Someone who matured too early often carries this tension quietly. They learned that being dependable earned stability, while expressing confusion risked becoming another problem for someone already overwhelmed. Over time, the unconscious creates a simple equation: safety comes from needing less. That belief begins influencing decisions without announcing itself. You decline invitations before considering whether you actually wanted to go. You reassure others before checking your own emotional state. You become fluent in responsibility, while slowly forgetting the language of receiving. Carl Jung described the shadow as the parts of ourselves pushed beyond awareness, because they once felt unacceptable. For the emotionally independent person, the shadow is not always anger or selfishness. Sometimes it is tenderness. Sometimes it is the longing to be comforted without having to justify why. That hidden longing rarely disappears. Instead, it finds quieter ways to speak. It appears in unexpected disappointment, when someone forgets an important date, even after you insisted it was unimportant. It appears in the unusual relief you feel when another person notices your exhaustion before you mention it. The unconscious keeps searching for what it once missed, even while the conscious mind insists everything is under control. This creates an internal conflict that is easy to misunderstand. You may believe you fear intimacy, yet what you actually fear is becoming emotionally dependent on something that could disappear. Those are not the same experience. One avoids love itself. The other protects against repeating an earlier wound whose emotional memory never fully faded. Viktor Frankl believed that human beings can endure extraordinary hardship when they discover meaning within it. Yet meaning is not created by pretending pain never existed. It emerges when old survival strategies are recognized for what they were: remarkable adaptations that deserve gratitude without being allowed to govern every future relationship. There is another subtle mechanism at work. The mind naturally searches for evidence supporting its oldest expectations. Daniel Kahneman explored how our judgments are shaped by mental shortcuts, and emotional life follows similar patterns. If you expect disappointment, your attention quietly notices every delayed reply, every canceled plan, every forgotten promise. While moments of genuine care pass by almost unnoticed, because they do not fit the established narrative. Gradually, the world begins reflecting the story you already carry. Not because reality has become crueler, but because perception keeps returning to familiar emotional territory. The child who once believed they had to manage alone quietly continues making the adult feel as though solitude is the safest destination, even when companionship stands patiently nearby. Understanding this does not erase what happened. It simply reveals that your present reactions are often conversations with experiences that no longer exist in the same form. Once that becomes visible, the entire architecture of your emotional life begins to look less like fate and more like a map drawn by a younger version of yourself, waiting to be read with different eyes. There comes a moment when the story begins to shift. Not because the past suddenly becomes easier to carry, but because you stop judging yourself by the survival methods that once kept you standing. What once looked like emotional distance starts revealing itself as evidence of how resourceful you had to become. The years you spent believing you were simply different begin to take on another meaning. You were not born expecting little from others. You learned to expect little because life quietly rewarded self-reliance more consistently than vulnerability. That lesson shaped you, but it never defined the deepest part of who you are. Seen through this lens, the loneliness was never proof that you were incapable of connection. It was often the consequence of carrying yesterday's emotional rules into relationships that belong to today. The pain remains real, yet its meaning changes. It becomes less of a personal flaw and more of a chapter in your psychological development. Many people never reach this realization because it asks them to loosen their grip on an identity that once protected them. Yet something remarkable happens when that grip softens. You begin noticing that strength and openness do not compete with one another. They quietly complete one another, preparing you for a life guided less by old fears and more by conscious understanding. The quiet tragedy is that not everyone allows this new perspective to reshape the story they continue telling themselves. Not everyone reaches this point. Some people spend years understanding their past without ever allowing that understanding to change the meaning they assign to it. The story remains frozen, even as life quietly offers new experiences that no longer fit the old conclusions. One person begins believing their independence proves they are unlovable. Another mistakes constant self-sacrifice for emotional maturity. Someone else compares their life to people who seemed supported from the beginning and quietly concludes they have fallen behind. The hardship may have been similar, yet the interpretation becomes the force shaping everything that follows. Over time, bitterness can begin wearing the same face as wisdom. Emotional distance starts feeling like discernment. Avoiding vulnerability is mistaken for strength. Without noticing, a person protects themselves so completely that they also protect themselves from the very connection they have always wanted. The difference is rarely found in what happened. It is found in the quiet story repeated each day about what those experiences mean. That story can become either a prison built from old conclusions or a doorway toward a more authentic life. One final psychological shift quietly separates those two paths. The final shift is surprisingly quiet. It does not arrive the day someone finally understands your past, nor the moment life becomes easier. It begins when you no longer confuse the person you had to become with the person you are still capable of becoming. That distinction changes everything. You begin noticing that emotional independence was never meant to become emotional isolation. It was a bridge built to carry you across a difficult season, not a permanent home where every relationship must remain at a careful distance. The bridge deserves gratitude, but it was never the destination. Slowly, your mind stops scanning every act of kindness for hidden conditions. You no longer feel compelled to earn every moment of care through endless competence. The need to prove your strength becomes quieter because your identity is no longer rooted in survival alone. It begins resting in something far more stable, the understanding that openness and wisdom can exist together. From the outside, almost nothing appears different. You still think carefully. You still value responsibility. You still appreciate solitude. Yet beneath those familiar qualities, something fundamental has changed. You are no longer living according to rules written by a younger version of yourself. The deepest freedom is not becoming someone new. It is finally allowing the parts of yourself that waited patiently beneath survival to step into the light, preparing the mind for one final reflection that reaches beyond psychology itself. Perhaps the greatest misunderstanding is believing that growing up too early makes you stronger. Sometimes it simply makes you quieter. Real strength begins when survival no longer decides who you become, and your future is no longer written by the fears that once protected you. The people who appear whole are not always those who suffered least. They are often the ones who finally stopped confusing adaptation with identity. If any part of this felt like something you've been carrying without having the words for, I'd genuinely like to hear your experience. Sometimes one person's story gives another person permission to understand their own.